flip my display settings. Someday I'll make it work correctly. All right, so we want to look at a couple of things. We want to look at some tools. We want to think about some of these tools as being both good and bad. So a lot of these are freely available, but if I can do it in a good manner, so if I can use it to protect myself, can I also use it in a bad manner to perform an attack against somebody else? And that actually is. So one of the terms you're going to see is something called penetration testing. So typically, you'll contract with another company to do penetration testing. So an outside firm, that's what they specialize in. So they're trying to look for what vulnerabilities are going to be in there, what systems. But before we do that, we need to kind of set some boundaries and some rules. Oftentimes, these penetration testers are going to be successful, many, many times. So they do find new vulnerabilities. But at the same time, we also need to be cognizant that they could get into data that we consider sacred. So in the case of us, it would be our student information data. If we're at the hospital, it's our patient data. If it's NASA, it's data about the latest rocket they're launching. If it's Tesla, it's, whatever that data is we need to plan it a little better. So that creep or expansion is really where we need to concentrate and worry about. Just like any other kind of project, they tend to grow, and so we need to set some parameters for it. Not that we don't want to find everything wrong, but we need to set those parameters so we stay away from areas that we already know, and we can look at our company and see what items that we didn't know about, and that's really what we're looking at. Things we didn't already know about or don't have a way to solve. So there's a lot of different ways we can do this. So there are sites and there are tools that we can get that are kind of a real quick one-stop shop pen testing. In other words, we download a tool or we go to their website and they try to attack us from the website. So typically these are fairly kind of a surface level. And if they get through, then we have a serious problem. But the other things we want to look at is we want to find things that if you were being targeted by the NSA, what could they get into, for example? So we're going to try to place them in that role of being a bad guy or a threat, and they want to be thinking in those same ways. So a lot of times penetration testing is not just about software and tools and skills of the hacker, but it's also those social engineering skills that we looked at again. Because you might call and pretend to be with, AT&T and try to get more information about the inside of that company. So, who should do it? And like I said, I've already said that I like to do it from the idea of somebody from the outside. Internal people have its cost very easily. There's not a ton of cost, typically some tools. But the problem is these people inside already know something about the system. This isn't their daily job. They don't do this for a living every day. And oftentimes, we know, if I'm inside on a team, I know that we have some vulnerabilities. Do I want to reveal those to my boss and to the company CIO? And, no. So sometimes we don't do everything we should just because we are internal. External, though, so sometimes these guys have a lot of expertise. They're very focused. There's some disadvantages. In other words, you're allowing somebody else to break into your network, and they're going to know a lot about your network when they're done. Does that make this a dangerous issue? What if they decide to sell it to a competitor, or maybe they're not as legitimate as what they appear? Does that happen? What if they had an individual on their team that said, man, I bet I can sell this information on the web? So we do have to be careful. We got to make sure that we're doing that. And then this is an interesting model. And that is something called crowdsourcing. You guys all heard crowdsourcing before? So when I go to Yelp, Yelp is a great example of a crowdsource. When I go to Yelp, I'm getting reviews from all kinds of people, right? I'm not getting reviews from Yelp itself. I'm getting that crowd to provide information. Well, the same way, we can actually look at some of our networks and our software being crowdsourced. So a lot of companies offer, they call them here bug bounties or cash. So there have been companies that have offered up to $1 million and pay off fairly regular to hackers who found exploits in their system and turn them in that way. So it can be a really great way to get some knowledge really quickly. It gives you a lot of people. It can, if you've had enough interest in it. Again, you got to worry about now, not only do I have one person with this much knowledge, I have several people with that much knowledge. So again, it's really all about some kind of a reality in there. So I will let you guys look at the little quizzes in here on your own on that one. So we need to think about what are those rules we write with this company, or even if we're doing it ourselves. And so when the test will stop, when it will stop, when it will start, and when it will stop. I can't speak there. So are we doing it at night? Are we doing it at day? Is it 24/7? What are the rules and limitations of time? The scope. Are we looking for internal pieces, external? What boundaries do we have? Am I allowed to come physically onto the campus? I will tell you, I got a hospital a couple of years ago. We did a kind of a quick penetration test, and they allowed us to go on the grounds of the hospital. And what that allowed us to do is get close enough to attack their Wi-Fi, which I don't want to tell you how bad that was, but it's now fixed. But the other area we got into was, like a lot of smaller hospitals, they don't have their own MRI and CAT scan machines. So they have, you see the trucks for the MRIs all the time going around, and they will park a truck there for a day. And some of you may have had the misfortune of getting stuck in there for a 45-minute MRI. Because they do that, and they need data, oftentimes there's an outside data jack. And so in the case of this small hospital, that data jack was live 24/7, whether that truck was there or not. And so I took a small backpack and a cable, and the backpack had, at that time I was using a very small PC in a box that I had set up. I powered that with a battery that was in there, and the battery would run a couple of days on that poor thing, and I plugged it in, and I set it on its attack venture, and I walked away. Now, Wi-Fi was crap, so I was able to remote back into that even. But even if I hadn't, I was in such a wide open configuration, I could find it again later. And it sat there for 2 days. Nobody noticed or said anything about a backpack sitting beside this pillar, beside where this truck normally parks. So, again, it's that idea. Maybe I didn't get that ability to do that. Maybe, sometimes you will get provided some additional information. So we might know that you're focusing on a specific target inside, and we know it exists. We know it's a ERP system, or maybe it's a time clock or something else we're concerned about. So authorization, formal document signed off, and I will tell you that this gets more important, especially if you start doing attacks on physical property. And we've had some sites, and in fact it was in Missouri a couple of years ago, some penetration testers went beyond their authorization and actually broke into a facility. Well, they ended up getting charged with breaking and entering because that was beyond the scope of what their original documentation was. So authorization, and typically everybody on your team will have a copy of that with them, just kind of in case we get scaled, or somebody yells at us, whatever. So the other thing then is how, when, and where does that penetration team communicate, and to whom? So does it go to the IT director? So we usually have a couple of people in that list. So if something goes wrong and the IT director can't be reached, or the CEO, or whoever it is, so when we start kind of a status, if we have any incidents. So for example, I'm planning that bag, and I ran into the maintenance guy, and he told me to grab my stuff and get out of there. That's something I would turn in pretty quickly just to stop that from going anywhere. Any kind of an emergency. If we broke in and suddenly oh my goodness, the network went dark. What happened? Those kinds of things. We also typically have at the end a cleanup. In other words, any tools we've used, we remove. We teach the IT department there to remove them. Any changed credentials. Although I will tell you, usually credentials, I will do a full wipe of everybody's credentials, force you to redo your passwords and such, even when we use two-factor. It's not always as proficient as possible. And then you typically have a report. So that report, much like we did in project management and other classes, has an executive summary that goes to people like the president, CEO, those kinds of people who aren't techies, and then the technical person for the security professional. So those people in the IT department would get that kind of knowledge. So this is some of the vulnerabilities, and this is kind of a best guess in some cases. But patches are a serious update issue. They're also an issue because sometimes the patches break things, especially on Windows items. Sometimes we have to be careful. So there was a patch that went out last week that started to break printing again on the enterprise level. So sometimes those patches, it'd be great to say we're always updated on our patches, but we also need to probably test those patches. So operating system hardening, in other words, setting up best practices. Application hardening, so things like requiring passwords to access a program or internal item. So I saw recently a small town, and I looked at what they're doing. They have a billing system, and it does payroll and water billing and a couple of other things. But what I discovered was, instead of creating multiple logins, they all used a shared login. What's the problem with that? Is there any problem they're all logging in on the same username? How can I verify if somebody did a transaction incorrectly? Because it all looks like the same person to that system, right? So if somebody's stealing out of the till, it's going to be a little harder to catch those kinds of things. So, our famed phrase here, passwords. And passwords really are BS, because we'll look at some of the reasons why. But configuration issues, all kinds of other things. So we might look for all of those things and try to come up with a way to do that. So similar to what our YouTuber in there was talking about, we have a reconnaissance, and then we actually perform the penetration test. We want to know as much as we possibly can. So we might do things. So we might look at the web pages. We might actually visit the site. We might drive by and see if we can catch the Wi-Fi. Because a lot of times the Wi-Fis are not separated very well from internal networks and external networks. Not unusually use drones and those kinds of things to fly over and see if there's an entrance we don't know about. So the problem with using any of those actives, it comes back and haunts you a little bit there in that. So. And then finally we figure out, how do we get in there? And we need to really think sometimes outside of the box. So Target, many years ago, they came in through a thermostat system very similar to what we have on our wall here. It didn't, getting into the thermostat didn't get them a lot, but they were able to turn that and be able to get into access to other areas of the network. So these are not automated. These are done by very skilled people who, that's what they do for a living, is try to break into things. If I won the lottery and I could afford to do it, this would be a fun job to do 24 hours a day, right? You're getting paid to break somebody's stuff. So, the other thing we do, and typically this is a little more automated, is we look at vulnerability scanning. So penetration, we're hoping to get in. Vulnerability scanning says, hey, we're going to conduct a scan of our system, our network, our pieces, and we want to look and see if there are some of those on there. So typically we'd schedule our own vulnerability scans, and we'd try to come up with a way that we can get as much as done as possible. Now, a couple of things. So here's some examples of, in this one, this was a Nessus product. There are tools to do this, and so you would put these on, maybe run them once a week, once a month, every 6 months, whatever it is. And it can give you a lot of details and data about your network, including a lot of lot of information that could lead to somebody getting in. But they're not as in-depth. If you think about it this way, this is a very broad look at your network. But we still have the same kinds of things. What are we going to scan? Does it meet what our goals are? How far in depth do we go with that scan? Similar with the penetration test. What types of data? So, two types here. And so here's one of the interesting pieces. We call it credentialed, or in other words, I have login passwords, or I don't have login passwords. So, a scan that's intrusive says, hey, we're going to try to exploit it. Non-intrusive just points it out and says, hey, we got it. So, what you really do is set a baseline the first time you run something like this Nessus software, or SolarWinds, or one of the hundreds of others. And then over time, you build up an idea of what your network should look like. And it also gives you that, oh, wait, why did I used to have 500 data endpoints? This month I say I have 750. Did we grow that big that fast? So, taking a look at the results, we tend to do that in kind of a team and in a group. One of the other things we have to do is make sure that any false positives, so maybe we trigger off something and it really isn't an issue for us, or it's something we've already dealt with. So, internal data things like log reviews. It would be great if we could hire people to just scan through the logs of everything that happens on our network, but again, that tends to not be as common of an item. Right. Let's back out of here for now. So let me run over again what is required this week, just so everybody's on board. There is no discussion board. All right, so you should be able to do this project here, this critical thinking. I think we'll have time on Thursday to do this in class, so you'll be able to see it also. You need to do the simulation lab, the National Vulnerability Database. If you hadn't heard of it, it will frighten you when you start looking at it. This is just for information. The quiz over Chapter 2 were some points. And then this reflection is also, again, just for an information purposes. There is a practice test that you might want to look at before you come down and take this actual Chapter 2 test. So, there are my notes I've taken out there for now. There's an assignment this week, and we will also look at that on Thursday to make sure that corresponds. These are just some additional videos that are kind of interesting. So, in class, I made them watch part of the social engineering. I will also make them watch part of this power infrastructure. It's interesting to see what happens in there and why it happens. Oh. Let's take that out of there. All right. So that's what we need to do this week, and I will update the online class so that it reflects the same piece. So that is your assignment pieces for this week. Again, if you have any questions, call, text, email, and we will talk about those.